I'm really glad to be here today. The issue of sustainable beef is something that I've been watching for a number of years, and within ISEAL, we're really looking to see how we can incorporate the key sectors for sustainability within the ISEAL Alliance. And we see that beef is really one of those sectors that's making tremendous progress and has tremendous opportunities for going forward. So we're really pleased to be here today. So I have this for slides. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about ISEAL itself. So what is ISEAL and why is it relevant for you today? And along with that, our credibility principles, which are being used by standard sustainability initiatives in a range of sectors. I will talk to you about gaining consensus and bring some of those examples from other sectors, from our members, and then also talk about some of the innovations that are happening today in terms of thinking about standards initiatives, multi-stakeholder sustainability initiatives, and what are the new ways of thinking about how this can work. So ISEAL is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2002, and our mission is to improve sustainability standards for the benefit of people and the environment. So we really have a continuous improvement focus on sustainability standards initiatives. We are open to all multi-stakeholder standards initiatives, and these organizations must embrace our credibility principles, be able to demonstrate compliance with our codes of good practice, and commit to learning and improving. And I really want to stress that last part, because sort of compliance with our good practice guidelines is just the beginning. What we're really looking to do is create a platform for going forward as the world evolves and creating a good learning environment and collaboration environment for the sustainability standards. So we have 23 members. They include the Forest Stewardship Council, Marine Stewardship Council, the Responsible Jewelry Council, which is one of the first standards in mining, the mining sector, and that's an area where we see an increasing number of standards being developed. Bonsucro, and one I like to pull out because it's quite different from some of the others, the Gulf Environment Organization. So you might think of that as being a bit of an outlier, but they're really focused on the environmental issues in the Gulf sector. So our good practice guides are really applicable in quite a wide range of sectors. And here's just some that are covered by our members. And we're seeing increasing use of the concept of multi-stakeholder standards in a wide range of sectors. So a couple of years ago, we started a process of developing a set of credibility principles, really the overarching umbrella framework for what is good practice in developing a multi-stakeholder approach to sustainability. And we did these through a multi-stakeholder process. We did consultation workshops in Brazil, India, China, the US, and the UK. So we got quite a good, not completely global, but pretty good international input into the process. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them because we have a short amount of time, but I've picked out just a couple to talk to you about today that hopefully are particularly relevant for you all. And then one I'm going to mention just because of something someone said earlier today. So the first one here is sustainability, that you focus your effort to create a definition of sustainable practices that has clearly defined objectives, and that the actions and decisions that you take as a group align with that sustainability vision. And it's structured to actually deliver outcomes on the ground. A couple things were mentioned earlier. One was the idea that you don't have requirements that don't actually deliver something. And so here, that wouldn't be a credible practice. A credible practice is that you've got in your principles and criteria, that they actually deliver outcomes. And one thing here I also want to mention is the previous speakers have talked quite a bit about the local roundtables. If you share these objectives at a global level, it's much easier then to have alignment between those efforts at a global level and your national efforts. So thinking about how do you have sort of global objectives with the local approach. Improvement is another key concept, so that the work that you do is designed in a way to demonstrate and improve the sustainability impacts that you're trying to have on the ground, and that you've got monitoring and evaluation systems that can actually measure whether or not that's happening, and you're able to build that into a continual learning approach, so that it's not that you've achieved it, you're done, but that there's always going to be improvement that's needed. And relevance is another key element here. The most significant sustainability issues are covered. And this last one, the global concept, that you have global consistency along with your local applicability and adaptation. And you can do it sort of bottom up, from the local up to international, or the other way around. And the question becomes, in part, how do you structure it, and how do you ensure that you've got those global objectives, that you've got the vision? Eduardo mentioned the dream. How do you share the same dream and then apply that in each country? And knowing that you've got that similar dream in mind when you're creating your program at a local level. And lastly, rigor, that you actually have requirements that actually lead to progress, and that you've got, well, this says certification decisions, but as I'll show later, we've got a number of different systems that don't all use certification. So gaining consensus. I actually think that a lot of you in the room here have participated in a number of multi-stakeholder processes and probably have a lot of experience with gaining consensus. So I have a few thoughts here from some of the things that have been learned in other organizations, but I'm sure that all of you as well have quite a bit of experience to bring to this question. And certainly the experience that you've had in the past years through the various roundtables can lead to that as well. So starting with clear objectives, that was part of the credibility principles, right? That you've got clear what it is you're trying to achieve in the first place, and that you've defined the goals that you're trying to achieve. You might develop a theory of change. What is it that you do that leads to the outcomes that you're trying to see in terms of social, environmental, and economic performance or change? And does everyone agree that you're actually trying to achieve the same thing? Sometimes that's the hardest part. And so that first piece, and making sure that you're really in agreement on that first piece, might be maybe the most important part. Advanced preparation, or continuing to go back and loop around in terms of the preparation, the input process. Maybe in order to get to consensus on difficult topics, you need to increase the consultation or take more time to consult. Maybe you need expert technical input, or you might need additional decision-making criteria. You might, for some types of topics, need a different decision-making process. And on this one, the question of controversy, is there a particular decision you're going to make that's controversial? And that topic might actually need a more formal decision-making process. So I went to the Fourth Stewardship Council General Assembly in September, and they have sort of a multi-tier decision-making process. So topics that aren't very controversial or difficult, you hold up a green card, you hold up a red card, and you can see, is there consensus or not, and a decision is made. If it looks as though there isn't decision being achieved, they actually go to a formal vote, and they have a formal voting process that has been agreed on, so that it's not really at that point so much about consensus, it's about the formal voting process. And so that's another technique that's been used to address, sometimes there's difficult issues that need a slightly different, more formal approach. I was introduced recently to this consensus building process or concept called the groan zone. And it was described as, you start out with perhaps clarity of what you're trying to achieve. You open it up and discuss it, and you get into this really difficult place. That difficult place is the groan zone. It's when everyone starts feeling uncomfortable and you feel like maybe you've lost the thread or the direction that you're trying to achieve. And what I understood from this is that sometimes not being able to achieve consensus means that you actually haven't taken enough time in that difficult place to get the additional consultations, the outside expertise, the continued buy-in process that's needed so that you can actually then eventually get to the agreement. So I like the concept of the groan zone, because I think that there is a desire sometimes to get out of that difficult place as quickly as possible. And the idea actually is that you need to take the time there so that you can finally get to a good agreement. And then on the final agreement process, sometimes it comes down to a question of what can you live with? What do you really need? What is good enough? There may be a difference between the dream. Different stakeholders may bring different big dreams to the table, but ultimately in the consensus-making process, there's the question of, what can you live with? And is this good enough? Can we make a decision based on this? One of the things that I think is also has been interesting to me to see from the multi-stakeholder initiatives is that it's not a done deal, even when you've decided on a set of principles or a code. These are living documents. Our good practice suggests that every 3 to 5 years, you at least review whether or not your principles or standards need to be revised. You take a review moment to say, do they need to be changed? Many of the standard systems that have been around for a long time are now incorporating new concepts. They've had to think about climate change. Some of those that have been around for 10 or 20 years perhaps didn't have a climate concept in their standards. Or they've started to look at gender issues or other topics. So I think there's often a difficult process of getting to agreement because there's that feeling that once it's done, it's set in stone. And you also don't want to be fickle and changing all the time because that makes producers crazy. But you also recognize that it's an evolving process and an evolving definition and document. So not being willing to get to consensus also sort of means there isn't recognition that over time things may evolve and change. So I want to talk a little bit also about innovation in multi-stakeholder sustainability standards, because I think right now we're going through a very interesting sort of inflection point in how they work. And I want to leave you thinking about this because you're creating your definition of sustainable practices and how you're going to apply that right now. And you have the opportunity with the new technology that exists and the lessons learned from years of other organizations to create something new and to really sort of take all of that learning and do it the way you'd really like to see it work. So I want to share a few examples of how other organizations are doing things. So I've talked about standards. We talk a lot about standard systems. And when we talk about because we think about credibility as being the whole system. And you might have a really, really excellent standard or definition of sustainability that doesn't actually have impacts. And it doesn't have impacts because the rest of the way it's applied might be lacking in terms of its credibility. And this is where we're seeing a lot of the innovation, really, in different ways things can work. So in this up here, you see on the left the standard itself. You have multi-stakeholder input. You end up with criteria. In the middle here, you have the producers, the enterprises that are implementing a standard. And underneath them, you have capacity building organizations. Sometimes it's consulting firms, sometimes it's NGOs that are helping the producers to implement those practices. Sometimes it's internal in the company. This next one really, it says certification. I'd really like to modify this because we see certification, we see verification, we see a range of combinations thereof. Some of those systems have what's called accreditation. Then you have a supply chain aspect that eventually ends up at a consumer with or without a label. So some examples, I'm just going to give you 3 different examples here of how standard systems are structuring themselves. So Forest Stewardship Council was mentioned earlier. It's a multi-stakeholder driven, membership-based organization. They have something like 750 members. They have national standards initiatives. And interestingly there, they started out with local standards and international principles and criteria, but all of the indicators were at a local level. And now they're having a whole move to try to bring together their national approaches and their international approaches, and developing a set of international indicators as well. So it's interesting that 20 years after they started, they're taking a slightly different approach to the national-international interface. They have external certification bodies, one accreditation body, and a logo. So that's sort of the more traditional approach that, because FSC is very active in Brazil, many of you might be familiar with. It's sort of the traditional certification, accreditation approach. A different approach is a system called the Common Code for the Coffee Community, 4C Association. And they've intentionally, from the beginning, said that they're going to have an entry-level standard. They're going to be the baseline standard for the coffee sector. And so their standard has a step approach. It has traffic lights, red, yellow, green. It's intended to be applicable for all types of producers. And they have a hybrid assurance model where they have producer units that provide control for their producers inside the unit, and then a verification system. So they don't use certification bodies. They have approved verifiers, and the decisions from that verification are made by the Secretariat of 4C. And they don't have a market-facing label, so they don't actually make claims about their system to consumers. It's much more of a B2B system. And the last case study here is the Better Cotton Initiative. So Better Cotton Initiative they don't even call it a standard, they call it production principles and criteria. So they have 6 key principles. Their primary focus is a capacity building program, because cotton is produced largely by millions and millions of small producers around the world. So the focus on capacity building very strongly. And then their assurance program is based on a self-assessment, then a second-party check of the self-assessment, and then a third-party verification. And their claims framework, so what you're allowed to say about your system, depends on where you are in that process. And that's, I think, a newer system that's quite interesting to look at in terms of innovation and the direction that standard systems are going. I wouldn't want to leave without just talking a little bit about what's in it for the producers, or those organizations that are actually making the difficult work to implement these practices. And it was mentioned, I think, right at the beginning, that we don't want to see a certification program that has a bunch of complicated requirements that doesn't actually lead to something positive for the producers. And so this is really, it's actually mentioned in our 10th credibility principle. If you take a look at that, it's on efficiency, and efficiency is that you don't have unreasonable requests that don't actually lead anywhere. But some of the things that we've seen for producers include yield improvement, professionalization of the operation. Just thinking like a business is something often that farmers or other small enterprises haven't done. Market access, upstream investments, income stability. So some of the things that we're seeing in a range of sectors. I want a little plug for following up. We have a set of videos on our website if you want to learn more about the different elements of credibility and standard setting. And the last piece is the ISEAL Community that I just want to mention. Earlier it was mentioned the idea that in the future cattle, beef production, and forestry may need to work together. We're really looking at how we build a community of the sustainability efforts across sectors so that we can facilitate those collaborations. We have 6 organizations right now, for example, working together on the definition of living wage. We have a whole range of working groups. And we're really looking at this question of innovation and what is the future of where multi-stakeholder approaches to sustainability are going in terms of how they're structured, how they use new technologies to be more efficient. And we'd really love to see you there. We have members and subscribers that are all kinds of organizations, NGOs, businesses that can participate and help to drive the thinking about innovations going forward.